My name is Ryan Thibodeau. I'm an associate professor of psychology. I'm trained in clinical psychology, which is like the area of psychology that helps understand psychiatric problems, psychological difficulties, how best to understand them, to treat them, how best to diagnose, things like that. And so many of the courses I teach are somewhere in that kind of ballpark. One thing that I know about mental health, and especially mental illness, is that it's very, very complicated. I think that our culture embraces some very, very simplistic ideas about mental illness and what causes it and so on. And I think that, one thing that I've learned, and I think one thing that, scholars have learned, is that mental illness is usually very, very complicated. I think that mental health and mental, wellness, I think affects everybody. I think that even people who think that they're sort of like paragons of mental health, I think even, people struggle. Everybody struggles. Every now and then. There's a wide variety of problems with which people struggle. I probably don't need to tell you what they are, like, low mood and depression and anxiety and things like that. And I think that, not everybody, of course, is, disabled by these, kinds of struggles, but I think everybody can relate, really, because I think that living in this particular world in which we live, I think it's inevitable that people will feel some form or flavor of distress every now and then. I think that issues surrounding mental health and mental wellness, mental illness have been brushed aside for a long, long time. I think that we've been very, very uncomfortable talking about these kinds of issues for a long time, and I think that that's led to a variety of not so great outcomes. Really, this tendency to be silent and not to speak up. I think that it delays people getting the help they need, for example. And so I think that if we could have more candid discussions about mental health and mental illness, I think that'd be useful in a lot of ways. I think that education is really, really important, and of course, education can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. For sure, it can come in the way of formal courses in high schools or in colleges and things. I also think that to the extent that people have resources that are available on like the web, for example, and other places, I think that. Gosh, there's so many ways to increase awareness, I think. To the extent that people actually know, friends and loved ones who struggle, and to the extent that those people are actually willing to candidly talk about their problems, that's one way to become informed as well. I think as a culture we do a great deal to devalue people who struggle with mental illness and to avoid them and to reject them and things like that. And so when people are reluctant to come forward, I think that it's quite reasonable. It's mostly, I think it's because people are quite aware of negative societal attitudes and stereotypes and so on, and they want to avoid labeling themselves as being mentally ill, so that they can avoid public scorn, if you like. So I think it's entirely understandable when people are reluctant to speak up. I think that one really, really important thing that everybody can do, all of us can do, is we can, if we see somebody who's in distress, whether that's a friend or that's a roommate or that's a family member or other loved one, I think that approaching that person and asking questions, very simple questions like, how are you doing? Are you okay? Kinds of things. I think that those kinds of discussions can be very, very useful. I think that a lot of us are reluctant to do that because we may feel like we don't really want to get involved in people's problems because people's problems are very, very messy. One thing that might be clear is that people actually need services. And so one thing that we can all do, I think, is that we can all get a sense of what kinds of services are available to help people with mental illness, because it turns out that in our community there's a wide variety of really, really rich resources that are available to help people. But I think that probably most people aren't really aware of resources that are available. And so I think that in addition to committing to approach people who are struggling and asking questions like, are you okay? How are you doing? I think that's a second step might be to figure out well, what are the resources that are available, and then encouraging people to avail themselves of those resources. I think those two things together could be pretty helpful.